Okay, then I'll make a start. So today's presenter is myself, Robert Golding. I'm the MHHS Solution Architect on the programme, and I'll be joined by Kevin Gleeson, who's the Security Architect on the programme. Hopefully the presentation shouldn't last more than an hour. And as with these playback sessions, all questions, if they'd be submitted on Slido, that'd be much appreciated, rather than using the chat function within Teams. And obviously the presentation will be available as a recording at the end. And today's session will cover the data integration platform in more detail, focusing on what the DIP is and how market participants interact with it, and what resources are available to help with this, and the timelines associated with the DIP. So what we covered today is the DIP overview, the end-to-end message exchange, and some security surrounding the whole platform and the end-to-end architecture. Hopefully you've seen this slide before. This is an old slide which we like to put up at the start of most of our presentation. At the heart of the programme is the MHHS TOM. This has been refined over the last 9 months via the various working groups and design reviews. And how does the DIP fit into this, you may well ask? Well, before the MHHS programme started back in the autumn of last year, a large amount of work had already been done in the development of the MHHS TOM by the CCDG. In parallel, there's a proposal for the introduction of an event-driven architecture to support the orchestration of the TOM, which is done by the Architectural Working Group, the AWG. The AWG recommended that industry should look to adopt a more loosely coupled asynchronous end-to-end architectures, adopting a more modern technology, and was not bound by the physical constraints that the existing DTN system was giving them. An EDA system would be able to scale in the cloud to meet the demands of the MHHS TOM. Hence the introduction of the DIP, the EDA. One of the core use cases we're enabling on the MHHS TOM, sorry, too many H's there, is the exchange of half-hourly consumption data from smart meters to settlement. Eventually, 30 million smart meters will provide daily readings to settlements, and this is the role of the smart data service. This data is sent from the smart data services to Electron Central Systems via the event broker, via the data integration platform. By volume, in terms of numbers and the volume of traffic, this flow of data will contribute 95% of the message traffic that will travel through the DIP. But of course, there are far more processes that will make use of the DIP, and that is explained on the next slide. Hopefully, you have seen this slide before. It was presented 2 weeks ago by Simon in his design overview session. It shows how the data integration platform fits within the MHHS TOM. Each of the purple lines in the middle, purple or blue, purple, represents a separate logical data flow within the TOM. It looks horrendously complex, but in reality, it's really quite straightforward. Each of these message channels, each of these purple lines is realized by one or more message channels, which I'll be going into in a couple of slides' time. So what is the DIP, you may well ask? So the DIP is, this slide hopefully will give you an overview of the DIP. This is a service-orientated view of the DIP, comprising of 5 different services. The first group of services, are the core services that underpin all the rest, and they comprise of the messaging components that are required. So we have the core messaging sending, then we have the addressing of messages, we have the routing of messages by the DIP, we have message validation, and we have message archiving as well. And we also have a requirement for API definitions to be stood up. So the market participants will interact with the DIP via APIs and a user portal. We also have service management capabilities to support the smooth operation of the DIP. These will be done by the DIP administrator, and they are standard ITIL functions that will be required to manage the platform. We then have event message maintenance capabilities. So this will allow the DIP administrator to manage the DIP and add and remove message channels, create new message channels, and also refine API definitions. Then we have a reporting capability which will allow DIP users to analyze the performance of the DIP, how message channels are performing, what message throughputs, etc., and also give them auditability around the different message flows as well. And lastly, we have a capability for participant management for both the DIP administrator and market participants, who can provide facilities to allow access and provide them with the correct access and capabilities when interacting with the DIP. Even though, as I mentioned before, the TOM can look hideously complex, in reality, the interaction with the DIP couldn't be simpler. All the logical data flows, the purple lines on the slide earlier, are represented over two separate interfaces, one for incoming messages and one for outgoing messages. In the DIP, we adopted the industry standard of being able to use HTTP RESTful APIs with JSON payloads for sending messages, and HTTP webhooks with JSON payloads for receiving messages, i.e. one API will be sent for sending all messages and one for receiving all messages. Other APIs will exist, as you can see on this diagram. They will be used for the sending and receiving of status messages, or error messages, if there's a problem with a particular message flow, and also APIs for the replay of events and the replay of audit history as well. So that's the main way that market participants will interact with the DIP. However, there's also the need for a user interface. So these are the main APIs. Kevin will talk about how participants are expected to connect to the DIP, and I'll be talking about the API definitions and message structures in a few slides' time. How users will interact with the DIP. For the most part, they'll just be, hopefully the interaction should be fairly seamless via the APIs. However, a portal will exist, which will hopefully look nothing like this. This screen, all it attempts to do is mock up what the different facilities are required to be available to the market participant. So they'll need to have capabilities where they can undertake message management, user management, view performance reports, and obviously have interaction with the service desk. So the main one in terms of functionality would be the message management capabilities, which they'll be able to see the different processes and the message flows within those business processes, where they'll be able to see the flow of messages that they are responsible for and how they're flowing through the DIP. They also be able to see interface definitions, the swagger definitions, and also any audit reporting as well. The documents that underpin today's presentation are those indicated in the middle section there. They follow on from the earlier work which has been undertaken by the business process working groups. They've been producing the business process diagrams, business process descriptions, the interface definitions, and the operational choreography. So for the DIP, we produced at the bottom there, we produced a DIP functional specification and a DIP functional non-functional requirement spreadsheet. The purpose of these two documents are obviously to describe what the functionality of the DIP is and what it was going to do, but it's also going to, the major use is to help with the procurement exercise which is happening at the moment. So the documents in the middle are the ones that will help market participants with the development of their own systems. So probably the most important one of those is the end-to-end solution architecture document, and then the end-to-end requirements as well. Hang on a sec, people. I just want to mute somebody. Right, it's been muted. Where was I? Say, yeah, the end-to-end solution architecture document and the end-to-end requirements documents. They inform participants on how to their responsibilities and their interaction with the DIP. In parallel with those, there's the end-to-end security architecture document and the end-to-end security requirements document that tells people, obviously, regarding security aspects and how they're meant to connect with the DIP. In addition, we have the Swagger definitions, which is what I'm working on at the moment. They're being prototyped, and they will actually provide the API definitions for users when they actually start to connect with the DIP. We always talk about the DIP in the present tense, but I'm not sure if everybody knows, but the DIP doesn't actually exist at the moment. It only exists in our heads and in our documents. The program is undertaking is in the middle of a procurement exercise to establish who the provider of the DIP will be. We hear the term DIP SP, DIP service provider, and that's the term used for the party that will undertake this role. So say the procurement exercise is in progress at the moment and is due to complete in the autumn, with the internal preferred bidder recommendation made late October, early November, and the contract signing would happen around the 2nd or 3rd week of November. This is a logical representation of how market participants will interact with the DIP. So a market participant will have a number of different roles when they sign up to the DIP, and those market roles will give them access to different message channels. The program has taken the term an interface as the sending of a message into the DIP. A publication is when a message is published by the DIP and received by a recipient. Market participants will have the option of providing of having to proxies to have other participants, this will allow them to. Participants will be able to set up proxies that will allow them to assign message channels to different IDs. This will help in their design and development of their own IT systems, where they may have different systems handling different message flows. Similarly, with DIP connection providers, which are third parties which can act on the behalf of market participants. The whole onboarding process is still yet to be worked through. However, the working assumption is that the DIP registration process will piggyback on the BSC registration process. This is going to be worked out in the latter part of this year. I'm whizzing through these, so if there's any questions, please put them through into Slido, because this is going to be done in well under an hour at this rate. This slide describes the typical message journey of the journey of a message through the DIP from sender to recipient. We've identified the different key points at which a message is validated and then relayed onto its recipient. We've got on the diagram here, you can see level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, and level 6 validation. When a message is sent by a sender, it's received at the message gateway on the DIP. Each message is sent with a unique reference or GUID by the sender. On receipt of the message, the DIP will provide a response that will tie this message by its sender unique reference to a DIP unique reference, the transaction ID. This will be then returned back to the sender once the message is received by the DIP.
This is the initial handshake, which gives a level of comfort to the sender that a message has been sent, and it's got and it can track both its reference and reference provided to a DIP through the system. On the happy path of the message, that this is the only interaction. This is the only response a sender will get once it's sent a message, because it's the default case on the happy path is a message is sent and it's going to be successfully consumed by a recipient. On the unhappy path, there are various points along the message that it can be rejected at points level 2, level 3, or level 4. And at each of these points, if a message fails its validation for whatever purpose, for example, at level 2, the DIP is unable to recognize a recipient of a message, it will need to say to the sender, I don't understand how you're addressing this message, and it will need to send a message back to the sender, and this is done via this send status back to sender message, which is then obviously relayed back to the sender via the webhook. It can also fail when the message is attempted to be relayed to the recipient at the level 3 validation there. For example, the recipient rejects it for some reason, or it can reject it once it's actually digested the contents of the message. Again, the message, the bad path on the message is via the channel at the bottom, via the 7, 8, and 9 steps below, and they are received via the second API, which I mentioned above, the send status message. Message formats. 2 different types of message patterns have been introduced. We talk about pattern A and pattern B messages. Pattern A messages are just simple JSON messages where the whole message payload is found within the message. Pattern B messages are also simple JSON messages. However, they contain a URI to a location where a report or an external payload can be found. Most of the pattern B messages will originate from the Electron central systems and reports that are generally available for public consumption. Market participants will have the option of how they want to access the pattern B messages, because effectively the pattern B message is just a notification and a pointer to where the actual so the message payload, the business data is to be found. So it would depend on the complexity and maturity of their IT estates, i.e. automatic or manual consumption of these reports. At present, we're working on the message payload and definitions, and so getting together the Swagger definitions that underpin these messages. There is an existing presentation that Sean and I gave about 3 weeks ago. It was referenced in his talk yesterday. So rather than going into the details of message exchange and the formats of messages in this presentation, I'd like to reference you to that presentation, because that gives it a much greater detail and it'll save me repeating myself as well. So Kev, are you on the call?
I certainly am, Rob.
Kev, can you take over for your... I'll hand over to Kevin now for his slides on the security architecture.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Rob's just mentioned, my name's Kevin Gleeson. I'm the Information Security Architect in the MHHS programme. And I will take you through the next few slides on the security aspects of a DIP. So I was going to start off with a little bit of background, as Rob did earlier, on what came out of the AWG in terms of security requirements, which on this slide, as you can see here, it goes through data integrity, information model compliance, all the GDPR and data classifications, identification, authorization, and data security, IAM. And I've drawn this one up to just purely to say that we've accounted for all of these in the security requirements for the DIP. Could you hit the next slide, please, Rob? Thank you. And following on from those security and governance recommendations from AWG, they also produced this, which is a visual aid really around the different core aspects for security for the DIP itself, like off-gem SPA, privacy classifications, the NCSC CAF, and the NCSC cloud security principles. And again, I purely put this on there to say that all of these were followed in reaching the security requirements that have been fed in for the DIP. Again, Rob, could you move on, please? So I think this is probably one of the more interesting slides for the market participants, as it lays out what is required in terms of connecting through to the DIP. We've had many detailed conversations with Ofgem regarding what the security aspects will be for connecting to the DIP, and where we've come to is, as per other projects within the industry, is MTLS for the physical connectivity between the market participant and the DIP platform, and we'll be using digital signatures for the message integrity and non-repudiation aspects for messages sent through the DIP. Along with this, then there should be a valid and up-to-date DPIA from the market participant, the DIP service provider, and any receiving parties regarding the messages. Additionally, we have tried to not burden any of the market participants with additional security requirements or minimum security requirements, if you will, when connecting through to the DIP. I suppose our hope is that through other onboarding aspects into ECAS, CCAS, BSC code, the market participants are already performing risk assessments and having to ensure that they meet minimum security controls. So the view is providing the infrastructure and the technology that would be used for connecting through to the DIP is covered within those assessments, then we wouldn't be looking to apply anything else. And as part of any onboarding, we are expecting the ESO to check that that's the case. Should the market participant not have a valid risk assessment that covers that technology, then there would be a requirement for those systems to meet a minimum set of security requirements, which the ESO should be providing guidance on. Rob, would you like to move on, please?
Yeah, no problem.
So with all those things in mind, the first real decision to make was what would be the security architecture for the DIP. There's generally the traditional security architecture and an adaptive security architecture, which is the one we eventually chose for the DIP, or a newer mesh type architecture, which really only comes into play with more complex solutions and distributed systems. So here is an overview of what an adaptive security architecture would look like in terms of a security management and automation type platform, and it covers off all the aspects that we would want to be in place to manage the DIP securely. So the orchestration and automation is there really to remove the more manual aspects of a traditional security architecture. The use of modern threat intelligence, artificial intelligence, machine learning to sort of punch into the predict and prevent type areas. And then we have the detect, respond and recover elements, which in cloud platforms becomes a little bit easier in some areas. And I'll touch on some of that as we go through the remaining slides. You move on, please, Rob. So what I want to do here was try to articulate the due diligence that we'd done in terms of defining all the security requirements for the DIP. And going back to the second slide in this set was around the NCSE CAF, the NCSE Cloud Security Principles, which are fantastic, but don't really define in detail the security requirements. So as part of the exercise to defining the ultimate security requirements for the DIP, I did a mapping exercise against CIS, Nist, and the NCSE CAF to ensure I'd covered all aspects. And the reason for that was CIS has a very good mapping of all the security controls into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework is what used for the risk assessments against the security controls for the DIP. The mapping into Nist was really to get to the NCSE CAF mappings. So across those three, we fully mapped out the end-to-end security requirements, which was around 120, I think, that we went into the RFP process with, to ensure we'd covered all the main areas and hadn't missed anything. And ultimately mapping that back into a risk assessment, we were covering all those security controls as well. So that's the approach we're taking, and the risk assessments, as I touched on there, I built a number of threat use cases that were used in the risk assessment, which were unmitigated risks, along with threat actors, primary and secondary vulnerabilities. In addition to pushing that through a risk assessment tool based on IEC 62443, so anybody who's familiar with these, that this is more around industrial controls, but it maps nicely in terms of policy domains, and conduits within the industrial control model against what fits in with the adaptive security architecture and the cloud type model. And the second risk assessment tool is a freely available one, which goes through 39 different aspects of risk assessment, and is a lot more focused around cloud, and in this instance more of a financial services aspect rather than energy utilities. But that was the one I had available at the time. Could you move on to the next one, Rob, please? So it is the output from those risk assessment tools. The one on the left is from the FFIEC, which is the freely available one. And as I mentioned, that takes into account 39 different risk assessment criteria in building this model. And the ones to the right, the IEC, is an example of a number that I mapped in using threat use cases built against the security controls for the DIP. And of those, it really didn't seem to make huge difference how I mapped those and what threat use cases I built. We was always generally around a low to moderate risk. Thank you, Rob. Can you move on, please? So it is a high-level overview of that connectivity that Rob mentioned earlier. We have market participants connecting via API services. That could be API endpoints, webhooks, showing there the MTLS encrypted connection through to that. Likewise, HTTPS sessions for the user portal, which we would expect standard managed identities and multi-factor authentication to gain access to those portals. The DIP administrator themselves in terms of managing the content behind there. And in the bottom of this one is the DIP service provider and their access to the cloud platform for management activities. In all instances, all of those channels would go through a standard set of security services that cover DNS, DDoS, there'll be WAF encryption requirements. We have certificate services. I'll touch on that one a little bit further. And so all the clever tooling that ensures that connectivity through the DIP is secure, it's monitored, and is providing the right levels of security. Could you move on to the next one, please, Rob? Here is a higher level sort of diagram on the page, trying to pull together all the things that have been discussed. So for a market participant connecting through to the DIP, it's obviously a requirement for a DPIA. There'll be a PKI policy, so mentioned certificate services within the DIP. Certificates would be key to ensuring the security and integrity of information. This has caused a level of, I wouldn't say concern, but a number of conversations through the security design working group on how this would be approached. The consensus was, were possible, we would follow what has been done previously in terms of the people process side of a PKI policy that was published under the faster switching program, which I think is referred to as the SWICI. In terms of the technology chosen, then we are leaning more for a cloud native PKI service rather than trying to interface with the DCC's current PKI service, but that's not fully set in stone yet. Again, in this diagram, I expanded a little bit more to show the type of services that the DIP service provider will be bringing into this in terms of how it looks at the security posture of the DIP, how security events and notifications will be interacted between the DIP service provider and the DIP. And in the middle there, just really identifying the workload management, machine learning, artificial intelligence. And a big piece around all this is identity and access control. So all the authorization and authentication protocols and requirements that will come out, and the detailed design. Thank you, Rob. Could you move on to the next one, please? And I thought I would touch on quickly is the secure application development. So security is embedded in all aspects of a DIP from day one when the tenant is originally set up right through to the fully functioning production environment. In terms of application development, we'll be ensuring that all devices used for code development are secured, that everything is deployed through code, infrastructure as code, low code. That would be the likes of Terraform and other cloud native products for achieving that. As part of that process, all code will be statically checked and dynamically checked, along with quality and vulnerability scanning of those code libraries to mitigate any third-party risk and that type of thing along with this development. And again, any interaction with the DIP will be through those security services, DDoS, DNS, and obviously they will be built and published by the DIP service provider there as well. I haven't specifically drawn out the different test environments, but I've noted those on the right that we will have a number. It's, for example, in production environments, all of these will be deployed from the same code that is used and promoted into each environment, obviously with varying levels of compute power that sit behind these. Safe to touch on here is all storage within the DIP will be FIPS compliant, encrypted storage, immutable, so that it retains its integrity. And again, anything that comes out of the core development in terms of defects will be passed into the change management process and service management. So visibility from all levels will be had. Hit the next slide, please, Rob.
Yeah, I think that's the end of the presentation.
It is.
Thanks, Kev. So any questions? So if you look at today's Slido tag, it is slightly different from previous tags. So if If you want to ask us, myself or Kevin, a question, please go over to Slido and type in the tag, and there's a few questions there already. I can attempt to answer
Rob,
them.
will I facilitate getting through those questions for you there now? We have them arranged by the top of the TBCs there. So
Thanks.
First question that came in, and like Rob said there, is the code is a little bit different today just because we had overlap with the MPAN ownership session. So it's MHHS technical. First question that came in, Rob made a reference to another talk. Where can we find it? I can probably take this one. If this is one of the previous design playback sessions, they will all be available on the MHHS website and all under the events tab, and they'll also be available on our YouTube channel as well. We've sent out the link to that previously, so all recordings will be placed up there along with the materials on the public website as well.
So this one's slightly different, actually. This is Sean referenced this one yesterday, and I caught the tail end of his presentation, and it was done within the program, so it's not part of this set, but a link is available. So it's one that he and I did on how the interfaces would look like and the structure of messages. It's effectively the business meeting the technical and how we would orchestrate messages. So, but we can definitely make it available for sure.
Super, thank you. We have another question here asking, who will own the DIP interface catalog and how will changes to messages be agreed, versioned and communicated? For example, will this be the REC?
So it won't be the REC. So I don't know if people are aware, but earlier in the year, the DIP didn't really have an owner. There was it was left to Ofgem to decide who would effectively take ownership of the DIP, and it was down to either being the BSC co or the REC co who would be the ESO, the eventual system owner, service owner, and Ofgem decided that it would be BSC co. So even though it's not set in stone yet, I would expect that to be the BSC co.
Super, thank you, Rob. Another question here asking that, is it likely that existing software providers will develop a DIP adapter for market participants' connectivity to the DIP?
Yes, simple answer to that. Yeah, go and talk to your local software market adapter, and I'm sure they'd be more than willing to send you an adapter service.
Super. We love a simple answer on this program. Thank you. When is the DIP expected to be ready for testing by market participants?
All I can do is point people to the collaboration site and to look at the different plans and milestones that have been put up by the program. We're expecting the DIP service provider to be onboarded towards the end of the year. We've had a great round of presentations from potential shortlisted providers, and they were asked to produce us a proof of concept, and many of them almost had working solutions, so hopefully it won't be too long, but I don't know. I would point people to the collaboration site and the milestones there.
Am I correct to assume there, Rob, that whenever that test is available, there'll be a lot of communication and engagement from the program out to the market participants on this?
Absolutely, and even prior to the DIP going live, there's going to be emulators as well for the DIP. I know there's a team busily screwing away trying to write a DIP emulator, which will provide effectively, as well as an interface where you can send messages and also provide a meaningful response as well.
Super. Thank you. Has there been any consideration of the operational and cost implications for participants of having both the DIP and the DTN coexisting at the same time?
Yes, there has, and this is quite a hot issue at the moment. All I can say is that the program is aware of it, and there are communications that are happening, and it's above my pay grade, to be honest with you.
Thank you. How will any unexpected high message volumes be managed?
Again, that's quite a simple answer, really. All the potential solutions that have come in to provide the service or using sort of cloud native technologies, which are very, very scalable. And the volume of messages that we're expecting out of the DIP is not particularly large by modern standards. If we say on average we're expecting one message per per. Now, as I mentioned before, the high volume, I'm doing my bunny ears now. High volume in terms of what the dip is 50 million on the consumption data. 50 million messages on a modern messaging platform is peanuts. Now, when we've gone out to the providers, it's not really a big issue. Our definition of high volume, yes, there can be peaks, but it's not really causing concerns of any of the potential providers in terms of the volumes we're expecting.
Thank you. Will there be a specific penetration test of the dip?
There will be. Kev, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah. So we have in the requirements for annual penetration testing of a dip from a check compliant provider. So yes, there are penetration tests in there and continuous vulnerability scanning.
Super, thank you. Who runs the PKI for the MTLS authentication? And does this already exist?
So it's an option we've been looking at and have discussed on whether we look to use what's provided by the DCC under faster switching. So that is something that has been rumbling away in the background. For the purpose of the RFP, we've asked for the service providers to provide certificate services, and all of the preferences so far has been for them to do that as cloud native rather than bringing in certificates from an external source. It adds cost to the solution. We've discussed this at length many times in SDWG, and the consensus or feeling was more it was the people process side that was the bigger impact, and certainly for that we're looking at following exactly what's been done for faster switching in terms of their PKI policy. So whilst the way that you request a certificate may change, how that's done, which people are involved, and all that people process behind it, we expect to remain the same. That helps. Happy to take further questions on that.
Super, thank you, Kevin. How will resilience be managed and recovery from planned or unplanned outages? How much headroom will there be, and how long a downtime will be manageable? 4 questions in one. I love it.
Yeah. So we this is something we obviously picked up on in our early days, and when we were defining the requirements for the dip, we've got very, very specific requirements around our RTOs and RPOs. We've got, for the less technical people, we've got an RPO, which is recovery point objective of 0, which is aspirational really. So the system in end-to-end system should not lose any data in any of its transactions. So that is practically saying you only consider a transaction complete once the party you've sent your transaction on to, be it the DIP or being it one of the connected parties, when they said yes, the connection is done. It's basically simple ACID transactions. How we maintain an RPO 0. Our RTO, our return to operation, 60 minutes. Because the DIP isn't a lights on critical CNI system, we didn't particularly want to give it a high RTO. We're giving it an RTO, say, of 60 minutes, and modern cloud architectures with availability zones and availability regions can meet an RTO of 60 quite easily, and all the providers that are bidding for DIP can meet these requirements quite happily.
Super, thank you. By HTTP for use in the DIP interfaces, do we mean HTTPS?
That's an easy one, actually. Yes. Sorry if I missed the S off earlier.
Super, thank you. What message volumes, timings, etc. will technical and functional tests go up to?
That's to be defined yet. So there was a testing working group set up. If people are interested in joining that, then they're more than welcome to. But our original scoping was for a peak of around 50 million messages a day. So predominantly they are the half-hourly consumption data messages, and we're looking at potential loads of up to 100 messages per second, 1,000 messages per second at peak load, which again for modern messaging systems isn't too onerous.
And we've doubled that in the POC as well, haven't we, Rob?
Yeah, so message volumes, it's something, it should be famous last words, and I know I shouldn't be quoted on this, but I don't see it being an issue.
Super, thank you. Is pattern B only going to be used for distributing the ISD initially?
So is that question geared towards ISD or pattern B? Pattern B will be used for ISD, but ISD will be made available on a website somewhere for obviously for people to download. But other messages will be transmitted over pattern B. For example, the load shaping service, we're expecting to be the results of the load shaping service to be distributed by pattern B as well.
Would PKI certificate-based authorization be MPID specific?
Kev, you answer that one?
I'm not fully familiar with all, but what's the MPID bit of that, Rob?
Market participant ID, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think I sort of understand the question. Yes, it would be, and also environment based as well. So
Yes.
One market participant would have a range of certificates as well, and also if they wanted to create a proxy as well, that proxy would need a certificate as well. And we've got a whole series of different environments, so you'd have a different certificate for each environment as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So it would be split by environments and IDs.
Super, thank you, Rob. Could participants be invited to the potential vendors' demos?
No. It's quite straightforward, that one.
Thank you. Are there alternatives to webhooks for channels with a very high number of messages, such as MPAN consumption, for example, a queue-based interface?
That's a really good question. So at the moment, we have just effectively our lowest common denominator is webhooks. But once we've got a DIP service provider on board, we could look at providing alternative mechanisms to connect, especially for some of the more high volume channels. Yeah, so watch your space really with that one.
Super, thank you. Is there a view on whether and when the DTN will be replaced by the DIP?
Oh, it's a political one again, isn't it? I think everybody knows the long-term aim is that the DTN will be eventually retired and the DIP will replace it, but I haven't got a clue on timescales or the thinking behind it really.
Used for other things apart from message flows as well, isn't it, Rob? But didn't that come out of some of the conversations?
Yeah, again, it's one probably not for this forum.
Super, thank you. Is there an API for registering and unregistering a new webhost subscription, or can that only be done via the UI?
Again, that's a great question. I think that's lower level design when we actually get the DIP service provider on board. So I would have thought that would be done via the admin portal, or as you say, an API could exist.
Thank you. Where is the subscription service, for example, for half-hourly data described?
So that would be in the Swagger definitions, which are in progress at the moment. I've got a few prototypes available, but I've only done 2 of the message flows at the moment.
Super, thank you. A very interesting question here. Now, how will any volumetric increases be managed? How much further investment or work in description, etc., would needed to move, for example, to 15-minute intervals?
So I don't. This is my own personal opinion. I don't think a move to 15-minute settlement would actually cause a great increase in messages on the DIP, because we are receiving daily consumption data. All it would mean is effectively a doubling of the payload size, because rather than having 48 values, we'd have 96 values for a day. But we still don't get one message, and I think we're more concerned regarding the number of messages rather than the actual volume of the payload.
Thank you. Will the provider of the DIP be applying NIST/ISO 27001 policies, etc., to the infrastructure? And will these be monitored and reported on for compliance?
Kev, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the DIP service provider will be ISO 27001. The requirement is that they meet the ISMS requirement. So yes, we'll be checking the documentation and processes against ISO 27001. And the additional one is yes, they will be baselining against either Nist, CIS, whichever one is chosen and agreed upon.
Super, thank you. Was that 50 million messages via the DIP per hour? And how many MPANs are providing 48 readings a day? Does that break down to 50 million per hour?
So I'm not sure if I made a mistake, but it's 50 million messages a day, not an hour. So we're in the end state here where every property in the UK has got a smart meter, and on average they will send 1 meter reading a day. Some obviously won't send a meter reading for a week. Some might send multiple readings on a day. Again, we don't know. It's just our initial estimation, and we're happy to be challenged on it. We're still waiting on the results of MP 162. All the people are aware of that change, so we are waiting. But again, we think we scoped the sizing of the DIP to deal with it, and so it's a modern cloud architecture, and they're ultimately very scalable.
Excellent, thank you. If a message property is optional, should it always exist in the message, but the value can be null, or should the property not be included at all?
So that's a good question as well. So Sean and I, we've had many discussion on this, and I can't quite remember where we stand at the moment. I think it's a very good. He presented a very good rationale why you should have a null value in a message. But I think it depends on which message as well. So we will be giving guidance out on that. It's something we are aware of.
How will valid participants and services for each message be communicated? For example, will it be similar to MPRC and MPIDs in the DTM?
I'm not sure if I understand the question there. How about so market participants will have a market participant ID, which is different from the DTN ID. We're hoping to have a mapping of DTN IDs and DIP IDs. I'm not sure what that question is getting at. Hopefully that answers it, but if the person who wrote the question could maybe rephrase it and could try and answer it again.
Super, thanking you. Does the assumption of 50 million messages peak a day fall away in the event that suppliers don't use an MDR, 2x consumption messages per MPlan plus other change of supplier, change of agent processes?
I think I need to get Sean on this one of the BAs, but I don't think it does, because the meter readings still need to go to the central system settlement, so they still need to go via the DIP.
Will there be more than one DIP provider?
That's an easy one. No.
Super. How will refinements or clarifications be presented to industry post DIP procurement?
Yes. So whilst we've been doing the DIP procurement, I've been updating both the functional spec and the requirements, and Kev's been doing the same. There've only been minor changes, and I have been given updates via the TDWG all the while that the procurement process has been running. We're, as I say, we're in the final stages of that, and then we will issue the final versions of the functional spec and the requirements as and when.
Thanking you. How would the DIP failover work if the primary UK regions fail? I.e., what is the setup of DR scenarios, i.e. traffic in active/active or active/passive life, active/passive/passive life?
Okay, so this is quite a topical issue because we originally had a requirement for full-blown DR in the DIP, i.e. to have have a separate system from the main system. But we spoke about this, and if people are aware that the way that these modern cloud architectures work, you have one availability region, which is to say typically UK South, and it has 3 availability zones, typically towns quite geographically located close to one another, where services are replicated. Now the issue is the 2 main cloud providers, AWS and Azure, have slightly different platforms in the fact that Azure has 2 availability regions in the UK, whilst AWS only has 1. And our DIP providers were providing different solutions. Some using AWS, some were using Azure. We wanted to present a level playing field, and we removed we spoke about this at TWG. And I spoke to the EA team at Alexon, and we removed the requirement for an explicit DR system. It was felt that a single availability region within the UK would provide the resilience, whereby services would be replicated across availability zones. It's very standard. It's a very standard modern pattern that most parties use, and it was felt that the risk reward and the cost of having a whole separate DR system wasn't justified.
Thanking you. Would some reporting not also be available in pattern B?
Not also. That's a bit of a negative question. Not also. So yes, reporting is majority of reporting will be done by pattern B.
Excellent. Will the guidance pertaining to optional data items be akin to the DTC's Annex C?
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of DTC's Annex C, but hopefully people have seen what went out week before last with the interface definitions. That is effectively almost the physical representation of the interfaces. They're being, as I say, I'm working on that at the moment, is trying to translate that into Swagger definitions, and obviously that will have the guidance for participants to follow.
You. Will market participants' IDs be mapped directly to BSC Co MDD?
I wouldn't like to say yes, but that's hopefully the expectation. We're still talking that one through.
Yes, thank you. Will the DIP be considered as national energy infrastructure? And are there any plans for this to be integrated into either the VES/National Digital Twin?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of what VES National Digital Twin is, unfortunately. But we're not considered to be, because it's not a real-time system. It's a settlement system. The requirements around our availability and our submission to our RTO isn't particularly high.
What is the use case for using a participant proxy? I'm struggling to understand how and when a proxy should be used.
So this is a scenario where a market participant has a number of roles within the MHHS TOM, but they've got disparate IT systems. They want to logically separate. They may still want to use, they have one market role, but they may want to operate their 2 systems separately.
In the event that the webhook push fails, what is the retry mechanism?
So we're using an exponential back off with retry mechanism. It's fairly standard.
This is a bit of a clarification statement here. So saying for Azure, UK West only has 1 zone, while UK South has 3. So if Azure was chosen, there would need to be a principle of using UK South.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Active/passive is a low resource setup that uses low spec resources provisioned in secondary region that allows traffic to be redirected so costs are very low. I think we're moving on to the more of a comment and less of a question. But that's excellent. Thank you very much for that one. And then, when requesting a resend, will only entire messages be sent, even if the requested time range spans different messages?
So this is, I guess, this is the replay mechanism. So at present, way it's spec'd, when a participant requests a replay, they can request a message channel, a start time and an end time, or a message sequence, and then all messages that they're allowed to see in that sequence will be replayed. And there's also a new filter on there, which is filtered by MPAN as well. So they can filter by MPAN as well.
Is there an option to receive alerts to a different URL if a message goes on a DLQ?
So if a message goes on a DLQ, then they would receive an alert back via the second message, the second API that I talked about earlier, and that is the send and receive status messages.
Thank you. And is the DIP expected to master? So it says, is DIP expected to master of MPID/roles? Is that maybe carry and master of MPID?
No, so I think I can guess where that one's going to. So that's effectively standing data. So there's still discussion around that, whether my own personal opinion, it should be mastered along with the other standing data in the Lexon central systems with the other sort of BSC data. And but we're still under discussion with that.
How long will the DIP store messages for, i.e. would it be possible for a marked participant to replay messages/events?
Yeah, so we've got a default of 2 years for data, but it's configurable on each message channel. So for example, consumption data, if we felt that a particular value, we could obviously put the retention period up for that for longer. And maybe some of the registration flows as well for audit purposes. We could put up the retention periods a lot higher as well.
Excellent, thank you. We've no additional questions coming through there. I'd just like to flag to everyone on the call that we do take these Q&As, put them through a bit of a due diligence process internally, and they're currently in the process of being uploaded to both the collaboration base and the public website. The link for that will be in the Clock newsletter today. We're kind of still processing through some of the other design playback sessions. So no additional questions coming through there, Rob and Kevin.
Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks for your time, folks. Really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day.